Our next discussion will be on the practice of journalism, the risks and barriers. And the moderator is our own Gwen Thompkins, who before she came to Harvard as a Nieman Fellow was based in Nairobi, Kenya as the East Africa correspondent for National Public Radio. Gwen reports on countries, people, and happenings from the Horn to the heart of Africa. Her reporting adventures once took her to Antarctica, and just before leaving for Cambridge, she completed a fascinating radio report on her journey on the Nile that was rich with both historical context and scenic details. From 1996 to 2006, Gwen was senior editor of Weekend Edition Saturday, and while at Weekend Edition, she reported on her hometown of New Orleans, and in the months following Hurricane Katrina, she filed stories on the aftermath of the storm and the rebuilding efforts in New Orleans. Please welcome Gwen Thompkins.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me today. I'm thrilled to be here, and to especially be here with my colleagues, who you'll be hearing from very shortly. One thing that I should probably mention to you is that I lived in Eastern Europe for about 2 years, from 1988 until 1990, based in the former Yugoslavia and traveling throughout the region. I can remember quite clearly what life was like in Eastern Europe before the fall of the Berlin Wall, before the fall of communism. It was, it's strange because when you talk to young people today, it's hard to communicate exactly what life was like during that time. And I don't mean to say that it was all horrible. I had a lovely time in Eastern Europe during those years, but at the same time, one couldn't be there without recognizing that most of the citizens you met were tethered to their nation, like pigeons, tethered to a string. I mean, the absence of movement, of free movement, was remarkable at that time. State-controlled television, radio, and newspapers were delivering the steady stream of propaganda, as you all have talked about before, hearsay and innuendo. Pravda, I remember Pravda quite well, during the constantly telling fables about banner crops and great production advances, at a time when the reality on the ground was much less thrilling. I also remember Politika. I don't know if you remember that newspaper from Belgrade, which told amazing stories of Albanian abominations going on against Serbs in Kosovo, stories that could not be substantiated at the time, and yet stories that people, particularly in Serbia, believed quite willingly. And the result of this kind of false news that was being reported and disseminated through the countries that I visited, at least, not only undermined public confidence in media, but it also undermined confidence in nationhood. And so there was a sense of a promotion of suspicion between neighbors. And that led, of course, in some cases, particularly in the former Yugoslavia, to very disastrous results. All these years later, as you all have been discussing, the media in Eastern Europe remains under pressure from private owners now who want to forward their own agendas, from powerful criminals, from corruption within newsrooms, and even from the old standby of government-sponsored propaganda. So I'm thrilled to, just as thrilled as you are, I'm sure, to hear from our three panelists. Now, these are people who actually work in the field, and irrespective of the joys of discussing policy, I always like to get down to the practical to see how people are actually working. And right now we have these wonderful, wonderful panelists who are going to tell us exactly how they have been able to maneuver in their various newsrooms and around their regions. So we have Stefan Candea, who is a freelance journalist and co-founder of the Romanian Center for Investigative Journalism, based in Bucharest, Romania. He's also a Nieman Fellow for 2010, and we're very happy to have him come. We're going to hear, please come on up. And what we're going to do is I'm going to name everyone, and then each panelist will have some remarks and that they'll share with us before our actual conversation begins. So, Stefan, would you like to go? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hi. I'm, I'm Stefan Candea. I'm the co-founder of the Romanian Center for Investigative Journalism. You'll have a pretty wide description of how we work in the Nieman Reports issue. And also there you have a pretty detailed description of one of our media owner in Romania. That's sort of quite telling for the rest of the most of the rest of the media owners in Romania and throughout the region. And that owner, we published the spring issue in March. That owner was already arrested last week over extortion, blackmail, and death threats towards one of his top manager. And he, during this week, after he was arrested, he sold his media group to another, well, businessman with no connection with the media whatsoever. Anyway, I will tell you a bit of about how our center work and go through the problems I see apply to the rest of the media. Our center, the Romanian Center for Investigative Journalism, has about 10 years and it supported cross-border experimental investigative journalism and alternative techniques and methods in the gathering of and packaging information, in publishing, financing, building credibility, and teaching others about what we have learned about investigative journalism. We are doing more than just traditional journalism, as you might know it. We are involved in producing investigative reports, building networks and online tools, but we are also doing training and advocacy. Our investigative stories cover organized crime, but also media, human rights abuses, networks of power, environment, resources and energy, sport, and we do some undercover stories. We are active in a post-totalitarian region in Eastern Europe that include the Balkans, the Black Sea region. And our activities during the last 9 years have begun to create a solid infrastructure for investigative-related journalism initiatives that stretch across this entire region. Now, when I started in 1999 doing investigative journalism in the newsrooms in Bucharest, you could still find typewriters. When searching for company information, I had to go to an office and ask a clerk to search through paper archives. And my first investigative stories I could perform using old-school stakeouts, interviews, and piling tons of paper documents at home. But now our subject of investigations are living in Eastern Europe, launder money through offshore schemes or football transfers around the world, buy property in the US and the UK, open accounts and companies in Liechtenstein, and bribe their way to get mining licenses in African countries, for example. So to keep track of such movements, I need to search from my desk through multiple databases, and I need to have access to an international network of journalists. But database access is a tricky thing in Eastern Europe. You get easier access to illegal data sets than to legal ones, and the legal ones are really expensive. Because of the lack of access to information, we've made a strategy in gathering databases, scrapping, indexing, building our own database, and then an online platform for our members. Wherever I travel, I collect any kind of database I could get my hands on, and there is an abundance of databases, online and offline, legal and illegal, that can be found in the area. The problem is not too many journalists are interested in them, and not too many know how to make sense of huge data. A few examples of our way to use digital techniques. I could spend a whole day in showing you the tools that are useful to us. We had to build our own database platform and developing our own publication to avoid censorship. So we kind of had to have our own management system for documents for the members of our center. We also published online tools, open for everybody. This is an example of Media Index. This is a database of media ownership, who owns media in Romania, what other business interests they have. You can see their companies and other and ownership of other businesses than the media. We are feeding local watchdog NGOs with data. This is a website about public businesses. We are putting together various transnational projects using a database format and traditional reporting. Like this is a project I did for a structure called Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, a detailed database with the most interesting people for reporters covering organized crime. Their past, their involvement with organized crime, the networks they have, companies, and so on. We are experimenting all kind of collaborative software for cross-border stories, but we face huge problems with the big technical differences from country to country. We are experimenting multimedia and photo support on blogs platform, like this reporting project about the Black Sea region. We are experimenting cross-platform publication and working simultaneously with local, national, regional, and international media for more impact. As I said, in order to use the new tools and obtain relevant information, we need to connect internationally. So we help build national and regional networks of investigative journalism. This one is a support structure for investigative journalism in Eastern Europe, a Danish finance support structure. We help build it. This one is a global network for investigative journalists. We were part of it since its establishment in 2003. And I mentioned this organized crime and corruption reporting project, which is an initiative of a few centers in Eastern Europe, centers like ours in Romania. The international connections also helped us find technical solutions to more experimental projects, like this one. It's the publishing of 16 hours of government CCTV footage from the so-called Twitter revolution in Moldova, in order to crowdsource the identification of those who were in charge of beating, and in some case, beating to death, the young protesters in Chisinau. And our international approach gave us access to more interesting data sets, like, for example, the WikiLeaks cables. Internet brought a really dramatic change in the last 10 years in Romania, but also in the region, and primarily in terms of online news platforms, access to public information, and avoiding censorship. But investigative journalism is more than just access to publishing platforms. I still cannot figure out how to investigate things. It's about resources, it's about money, it's about time to perform in-depth reporting. And the present ownership landscape leads to self-censorship and lack of resources for investigation, and the internet doesn't make any difference. You still need money to access and test the new tools and software. We never had the golden days in our media in Romania, in the region. Relevant and verifiable information was always hard to find. Separating facts from opinion was a strange institution. The managing editor, the publisher, and the business manager were the same person. And there was always a corrupt relationship between media as an institution and politicians or business interests. We work on investigative stories in a region where politicians, public servants, law enforcement, and judicial power and big businesses are all too often deeply corrupt and active as part of organized crime structure in many cases. A variety of models of such involvement exist. All networks, all of those models are networks of power based on former communist nomenclatura and the oppressive secret services previously serving dictatorship. Their power lies in control over information and absolutely no accountability. The framework in which we work means no culture for transparency and almost an absence of any meaningful functioning democracy. When I started journalism, the biggest problems investigative reporters had to face were those of violence, direct political pressure, censorship, and the danger of facing rigged court trials that could result in imprisonment or excessive fines. Plus, corruption in the newsroom on all levels. The same problems continue to exist in the area, and in some countries they got even worse, leading to the killing of journalists, the closing down of newsrooms. But some countries actually became softer on journalists, and court trial pressures come now from the UK, for example, where Eastern European oligarchs choose to take local journalists to court under the so-called libel tourism phenomenon. But political pressure comes in form of numerous and ongoing attempts to pass legislation that will somehow censor media. Such attempts come from the left, center, and the right, from both opposition and ruling parties. When they don't deal with the media, they try to produce legislation that will hide public information or details about how public money is spent. Ownership of the media is a huge issue, as I said, with local oligarchs and even organized crime groups investing in the media. They can afford to waste tens of millions of dollars to gain the power to pressure politicians and the judiciary. Whether they succeed or not, they subsidize a hysterical media because their business model is brokering and centralizing power into themselves. The alternative to finance independent investigative journalist projects are through grants from the media assistance industry. Only the US sent about 1 billion in our region over the last 20 years, as far as I can conclude from different reports. But there are some fundamental problems related to the policies of media assistance efforts. And a few based on my observations was the presumption that journalists will bring democracy in our region, and that only one specific style of writing is good journalism. There was no understanding of the fact that there is no universal model of journalism. The presumption that there was nothing in place in our countries in terms of culture, writing styles, traditions, ignoring the context, background, and things like strong networks of former propaganda journalists, for example. The lack of real competition and transparent criteria for people who are implementing media assistance programs, trainers, editors, managers, and so on. So despite this big assistance, looking back at the 20 years following the collapse of the Iron Curtain, I can say that we have a broken media industry. Thousands of trained journalists through various programs, they have no place to work and apply what they learn. The editors know nothing about what they learn, and the ownership is not interested in good journalism. Romanian media, but also regional media, looks like the media of 100 years ago in Western Europe and the US. Blackmail, pressure, extortion for advertisement, lack of any professional journalistic body, promoting ethical standards from within the newsroom, and the suffocation of relevant and verifiable information by infotainment. Ownership is increasingly concentrated more and more into the hands of local oligarchs. We are still living in an area with very fragile democracies, and the role of pushing democratic changes is still with foreign powers, as I can see, and foreign politicians. Local watchdog journalism has no power unless it's taken over by international pressure groups, advocacy organizations, or politicians. Therefore, we have to do more than just traditional journalism, as I said in the beginning. And part of our activities must involve teaching or advocacy for freedom of the press. Is this hindering our center capacity in focusing our stories? Yes, sure, but I think it's a crucial activity. As I said, I think there is a huge waste of good resources because of the lack of meaningful coordination among donors and the lack of direct communication with journalists on the ground regarding media assistance. And wasted media assistance money has the same negative impact as the flow of black money over journalism, because it sets artificial trends in assistance and in jobs. It creates a strange establishment and gatekeepers for resources, and there is no strategy to invest in an infrastructure that will support and encourage organic development from new generations of young local journalists. Most of the money spent on training programs has only created the odd profession of universal trainer or grant writer, and the business of conferences, tourism, and the building bureaucracy around that. There are a lot of full-time media preachers who do nothing else but travel the world from one country to another, from Russia to Afghanistan to China to Mexico, and now heading to Egypt, telling everybody that we need more and more training, no matter the context. I can tell you that the direct collaboration with foreign journalists and editors in Western Europe and the US was the most efficient training I ever had. And I can also tell you that the most efficient training I did was with students, not with working journalists. It takes a lot of effort to experiment on a long term and independently, and we are constantly underfunded and understaffed. Because of that, we miss a lot of topics that need to be investigated in our region. So until we figure out the business model, we kind of need this assistance, but as partners and not as an intrusive assistance, how Maxim was putting in his article he wrote for the Nieman reports. I see an urge in the radical rethinking of media assistance, the strengthening of global networks of working journalists, and the global consensus or formal policy on information and press. I will conclude by saying that we are far behind from media that developed for centuries in democratic environments. A significant change won't come overnight. It won't come thanks to the internet, or it won't come thanks to training programs, but by an experimental approach, partnerships, and sharing. We need to float various media platforms with honest and in-depth journalistic products in order to make the hysterical and manipulative journalism just another entertainment option. Thanks.
Our next guest is Maria Sadovskaya, who is a journalist from Belarus. She is now a student at Columbia University School of Journalism, where she's conducting research related to exiled media. She joins us. Maria.
Thank you. Well, before I start my PowerPoint, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my experience. I'm 29 years old and I've been a journalist since 15. So I started as a young journalist for local newspapers, then I worked as a journalist for a state-owned national newspaper for a short time. Then I transferred and did my college journalism degree and transferred to a national business weekly to be an international observer. Then I became an editor of European Union dedicated supplement. I also lobbied for the independent journalism union in Belarus. I spent half a year in the European Parliament during doing an internship, and then in 2006 I moved as a manager of exiled broadcasting project for Belarus from Poland, though we are not really in exile because we can travel there and back, and we have several accredited people inside the country. So many things I'll be telling you I have experienced on some stages in my life, and I can relate later with my personal anecdotes and stories if you have any questions. Saying that, I'll try an impossible task to show you the media environment in Belarus and also a little bit of history of what's going on there. First of all, look at some media freedom indices. I'm sure you all know of them, but just to remind you, we're again worst of the worst according to Freedom House. We're not so bad according to Reporters Without Borders, only 154th place, though it's a very serious situation, but they decided to delete us from the worst of the worst internet suppressors for some time. And then IRIX Media Sustainability, which is also quoted here, shows that we have 1.02 score out of 4, meaning we are 0.02 points are higher than the worst country according to media freedoms. And you can see it has been changing a little bit over years. It's from 2001 to 2011, but basically we really never crossed the next stage. Facts about media. First, look at media ownership chart and advertising market. The media ownership chart I show you here is from the Belarusian Ministry of Information, and it uses it to show you how diverse and pluralistic is the media environment in Belarus. For example, we have more than 1,300 printed outlets, and only 400 of them are state-owned, more than 900 are private-owned, and then we have around 200 something broadcast media and producing companies, and 72 of them are private and 168 are state-owned. So this argument always goes by Ministry of Information on OSCE sessions, and never we're saying here we are, what authoritarian society you have? We have all those majority of media. So it's very useful to look on the right side, and it's Belarusian Association of Journalism statistics that under 30 non-state media, printed media, dare to cover political and social events independently, meaning dare to present any point of view which is different from state-owned news agency. And it was 60 in 2003. And here I'm talking not only about national printed outlets, but any printed outlets, including small regional newspapers who are registered. Also, as you see, the biggest advertising share in Belarus goes to TV, but there is no radio or TV channels with independent editorial agenda. All of the TV channels are state-owned or half-state-owned, or if it's Russian channels, then some of the content is censored and replaced by Belarusian programs if it touches Belarusian issues. Also, if you try to work in this situation for foreign outlets, any foreign, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, BBC, you have to get accreditation from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, otherwise you are regarded as a person who is doing something criminal and you can be thrown into jail. Still, there are several outside broadcasters who try to fill the gap, and I'm talking about traditional broadcasters like Radio for Europe, Voice of America, but also recent ones like Belsat TV from Poland, Radio Racja, European Radio for Belarus, where I worked several years, and several others. And internet media are not regulated yet, because legal mechanisms exist, and I'll talk about it later. So, how does work of journalists look like legally in Belarus? First, we have two big Ds, is defamation and discredit. These are both criminally punishable parts of our legislation, and journalists can be punished upon them. In 2001, we started having several sentences for defamation of the president or any official, and journalists were thrown to jail. Discredit is still a passive norm in legislation, meaning that journalists are warned that they can be persecuted for discredit, but no one has been thrown to jail yet. In 2005, we had a funny re-registration of media, and any private company who had the Belarusian in the title had to re-register because it became prohibited for non-state actors to be called Belarusian. So several media outlets suffered because of that, because they just didn't get re-registration. Then 2006, 2010, there were several warnings for unaccredited work, and 2010, journalists with no accreditation were jailed for coverage of mass protests because they were classified as participants. Also in 2010, Belarusian Association of Journalists was forced to recall its membership cards because they were stating press on the cover, and some journalists who were not affiliated with any registered or accredited media used them to secure themselves. And in 2011, right now, after presidential election, in the end of 2010, Andrzej Poczobat, one of the journalists, is facing charges for libel and defamation and discredit based on defamation, actually, based on his articles in Polish Gazeta Wyborcza, and is based on his private comments and blogs, which he was writing not as a journalist. It wasn't like that all the time. In 1991, 1994, before the presidential election, we had a relative free media environment. In 1995, shortly after Lukashenko came to power, his first act was to close the last, or one of the independent radio stations which decided not to follow the advice to take only state news. It was 101.2, and since then we didn't have any independent FM broadcaster who would. There are several entertaining stations who only give music and state news. So then in 2001 we had the first criminal case against journalists in Grodno, and whole circulation of the newspaper was withdrawn even before it went public, and they were jailed. Then in 2002 to 2008 we had massive closure of newspapers on different reasons, or they were postponed because they got two warnings, or they were forced out of the market because, for example, suddenly the state system of distribution and state printing house denied them any services, and then miraculously there were no private companies that would agree to publish them or to distribute them. So they were forced out of the country, they had to print abroad, some of them could not bear that financially, and that became an argument with in the dialogue between Belarusian regime and the European Union. So the European Union was saying return 20 newspapers to the market, and then in 2008 the state returned 2 national newspapers to distribution and printing facilities, and this was labeled as progress on the path of liberalization of Belarusian regime, and it was used as one of the arguments why the European Union has postponed visa sanctions against Belarusian officials. But after election crackdown, after presidential election 2010, when Belarusian leadership clearly decided to turn back to the West and go back to Russia and embrace their credits and their friendship, those 2 newspapers which were returned to distribution networks are now facing closure. And these other things that journalists face is one of them got 4 years in jail for being a press secretary for the presidential candidate and so on. And internet is promised to be regulated. They are just searching for the best ways. The broadcasting, one other FM station, it didn't broadcast any independent news, but it dared the only one FM station to broadcast election advertising legally of presidential candidates. It's closed now. It's in the court. And out of 4 major outside broadcasters, only one, Euroradio, has accreditation for several of its people, but even it, together with others, has faced equipment seizure when the KGB came and just confiscated all equipment and said, maybe we will return you. So as you see, challenges for media and journalists in Belarus. You see on the left, so you want to be a journalist, you've all seen or heard about this cartoon. In Belarus, on the right side, there is a high chance that you will have some legal persecution or be jailed, though I would say it's not norm for journalists. It's a threat which may make them think about self-censorship, which may make them think about changing jobs, which may make them think to emigrate, and so on and so forth. Especially that they have really low-paying jobs, and also if they do something in the newspaper can get a disproportionate punishment. For example, $30,000 fine for just putting the wrong photograph of a person or something like that. That all happened in Belarus. So Also, the problem for the whole media environment is that there are limited possibilities for professional education, because there are, for example, qualification ideological talks on entrance exam to journalism faculty in Belarus since several years. So if you do not answer something about who is the president, not who is the president, but why should you, behave properly and so on, you're not qualified even to pass exams to become a journalist. And then as for trainings, this is a part of civil society overall regulations that not only single projects, foreign supported projects should be registered in Belarus, but any seminar, training, discussion club, roundtable has to be formally approved by the presidential administration, even if it's free of charge and is not part of media assistance, which means that, of course, all those forms are happening, but they're happening abroad. It's very difficult to control who goes there. There are some media tourists, like Stefan was saying, right, who just go, because they have access to donors, and so on and so forth. The media assistance, I'll talk very briefly because you'll have the whole section on media assistance, but since the local advertisers are often scared to finance media, or are advised not to place their ads, it's not written order, it's just advised. They call banks and say withdraw all advertising from independent media, and it happens. The same with mobile companies. So facing this, most of the independent media, outside broadcasters, of course, and inside media search support from foreign donors. And there are three main types of assistance. Support to running needs or core needs, like paper for newspapers, like airwaves for outside broadcasters, and so on, when you don't really touch the money because you get it and you immediately give it to the printing house or to rebroadcaster. Then there are trainings and education, obviously, and then rescue funds they are not very advertised, because if the government learns that there are some money to cover fines, the fines will become even higher. But like Nordic countries and some others have these rescue funds to support families of journalists and to bail them out if they get those fines. US, Sweden, and Poland are the major single country donors, meaning they give the biggest funds, mostly because Poland is supporting the satellite TV station called Bielsat, and it gives like 6 to 7 million to that, 1.4 million to Radio Racja, which is available on the borders, and then like $200,000 to Euradio. Then Denmark and the Netherlands and Czech Republic are also active, politically mobilizing, coordinating donors, deciding, how do we decide about assistance, even if they have small money. They try to make sure that, that the whole community of donors is coordinated. Then the European Union, about which we talked already. European Union actually regarded Belarusian media for a very long time as a full-fledged business subject, and excluded it from any possible, grant applications. They were saying the EDHR, European Initiative for Democracy and Human Rights rule, specifically said in many times that media cannot apply because they're not non-for-profit. So, it took some lobbying and some persuasion, and it took some more and more repressions to show that independent media in Belarus cannot survive commercially because of this disparity in economic conditions. And the European Union miraculously changed their rules, so now the newspapers and other media outlets are formally allowed to apply, though they're still for profit, but the application process is so difficult and the qualification one has to show are so strict that still not so many of the media have capacity or enough financial capacity or enough human capacity to apply. Still, it has improved. Also, since mid of 2000 years, coordination of media donors has substantially grown. International Media Support, Denmark-based organization, since 2006 coordinates the meetings of the donors who support media for Belarus together with the editors and representatives of those media. Also, US and the European Union have quarterly meetings in Brussels where they coordinate the media support to Belarus and overall democracy support to Belarus. So it became better. Outside broadcasting projects are totally supported by donors, and they have different levels of impacts, but maybe not totally. For example, the radio station I worked for can earn like $100 per month for advertising on its webpage, but its annual budget is 1.5 million. Without foreign assistance and international lobbying, still there would be no independent media outlets in Belarus with independent reporting. mostly for financial reasons and for political support that gives the organizations. But the programs, as in Romania, often have to be more relevant to the needs of target groups. For example, the European Union has both EDHR and European Neighborhood Partnership Instrument. So under ENPI, it funded state-run television channel to run a program because it said, well, the reach will be better and we don't want to promote democracy, we want to promote the European partnership programs. And then under EDHR, it finances media that are in opposition to state TV channel. And there are other examples where the decisions on the media assistance are taken without really good consultations with local players. And at the very end, what online journalism does it. 38% of Belarusians have access to the web, half of them do it daily, 67% of them are under the age of 35, and this is the youngest internet audience in whole Central and Eastern Europe, younger than ever. I mean, bigger than ever group are under 35. Media outlets do not have to register their online versions, but if they want to get online revenues, they have to have a Belarusian domain and hosting, and this is controlled by one centralized state provider of web services. The online audience is steadily growing in Belarus, but the number of DDoS attacks, denial of service attacks, and service cancellations by providers, filtering, and so on is growing too. So, though we hope for internet, we have to be very, very cautious about how long the internet will be free in Belarus. And the impact of new media, as I told, online audience becomes a more important player. For example, Euroradio, I have statistic data there, from 2% out of 200,000 listeners 2 years ago. Now we have like 13% of 400,000 listeners in 2010 who listen to us online. So, like, the number of those who listen online is growing. Twitter, Facebook, Russian clone of Facebook, they all help to build connection with the audience. And if you look here at the Google map of solidarity, when a terrible blast happened on April 11 in Belarus, the radio, through its Twitter account, Live Air and Skype, turned to its listeners asking to contribute to Google Map, where will be the points, dates, and times of actions of solidarity with the family of those who were killed or injured. And this all was created by both the radio and listeners, and it was not possible probably like 15 years ago, right? No internet. So with online censorship as a viable perspective, media have to diversify the channels, use the new media while they can, but think about how to develop structurally, sustainably, and look into future. Thank you.
Okay, and then we also have with us Maxim Trudolyubov, who you've heard speak earlier today. He's he is the editorial page editor of Vedomosti, financial news organization, financial publication based in Moscow. It's a joint publication between Dow Jones, I believe, and the Financial Times. So, Maxim, can you come and talk with us? It's okay.
Do you have something
No, just my notes. It's okay. Okay, thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I'll just we'll try and draw a picture of where Russian media is today and how we are different and what are the prospects for the future. I think that I really liked the first panel and the discussion about the state of politics and state of civil society in Russia. I think it gives it's an excellent background for what we are doing back there on the ground, and very often we don't realize what it looks sort of from a high vantage point. I will, the way I think about the state of the media in Russia is the old media, the new media, there's really a divide. And it's not just like everywhere, anywhere else in the world. The divide is simply because of the technologies, because of the professional, the gap between professional journalists and everyone who's a journalist now. It's also the environment where we function, and the environment really contributes to this divide, because old media, mainstream media, and I come from mainstream media. It's a daily newspaper, just like the Wall Street Journal in Russia. It is published by Dow Jones and Pearson, the company that's running the Financial Times, and but we are totally and fully part of the Russian media regime, and we have to play by the rules. There are laws, and there are licenses. There's a system of warnings. A newspaper receives a warning if it's did something wrong. They consider somebody. There's a special agency for that. And most independent media actually already have these warnings, and you can get only 2. Once you get the second, they start the procedure of revoking your license. So this is a way of keeping everyone under subtle control. It's not direct censorship, but it's in fact the pressure that such measure exerts on you is actually very heavy, and I can see from my colleagues that being an editor under a regime like this is a very tricky business. You always have to think about the newspaper, and in my case, for example, it creates a weird situation where I am editorial page. I'm running an editorial page which is independent, and basically I can publish whatever I think is important, but I have to think about my editor-in-chief, because for the authorities, the editor-in-chief is the person who is responsible, and whatever happens, it's not me. They will subpoena her. We have a editor-in-chief, Tatiana Lysova, prominent journalist in Russia. So we have problems like this with the mainstream media. And the whole environment in the mainstream media, I always think about it in terms of islands. The very few independent outlets, like our newspaper, we live on an island and there are other islands as well, but sort of the surrounding ocean is the media that is controlled in different ways by the state or business interests on various kinds. So even despite the fact that we actually live on an independent island, we still have to play by a set of very awkward rules that makes us do things we don't really want to. And we watched the situation evolved. When we started exactly 10 years ago, actually 11, which coincided with Vladimir Putin becoming president, we saw the environment actually deteriorate. Now it's really hard to do certain things. Eventually, you can do many things, but because we are independent, because our publishers are committed to editorial freedom, but the environment very often makes us do certain slight compromises that really painful to to do sometimes. And then, so this is the old media, the mainstream media. And then comes the new media. And they exist in a completely different environment. It's like really two countries. I've just read a couple of days ago, there's a new Freedom House report on the freedom of the internet in Russia. And they qualified Russia as partly free. But I think they are exaggerating the pressures. In fact, in this case, I can tell you that it's rather free than partly free. In fact, they mentioned quite a few cases of harassment and pressure against bloggers, but this is really minuscule. And I know all these cases. I just don't want to go into details. But the thing is that, in fact, the environment is really free. The only problem, as anywhere, is coverage, and in the internet, the spread of the internet is still very limited. From comparing to the Belarusian figures, it's even less than it's actually even less than Belarus, which is on the one hand understandable, on the other hand, of course, regrettable. But whenever you have the internet, you essentially have an access to a very diverse and robust environment of all kinds, and it's been developing very fast, like really explosive. When I left for this fellowship in October, and now it really looks different, even right now. I mentioned today. I just want to mention this guy again because I just think that he is really great. His name is Alexei Navalny. He is a lawyer and he has a blog. What he is doing essentially, he is covering corruption cases. He's writing, he's finding documents, and he's finding whatever information he can come up with, and publishes it. He also created a web resource, which is it's a website where you can go and report anything that you think is suspicious. For example, you're going through the procurement documents online where a state company or some organization that working for the government is procuring for some goods, and you see that the price, for example, is inflated, which is very often, and then they publish it, and so it comes into spotlight, and people start discussing it, and we have a lot of cases. It's a big field right now in Russia. Somehow it turned out that watching government corruption very closely has become something of a national sport right now. Of course, it is limited to the group of people who have access to the internet again, but in big cities, it's almost everyone. And so I guess all active population of working age people, they all get their news and some commentary from the web. So this is where I think there is some promising development. Unfortunately, mainstream media is phasing away. It's really painful to say that, but I think it's happening even faster and even than I thought it would, and not just for the reasons it's happening everywhere, because of the advertising business model that is becoming less and less functional. it's happening just like this. And in Russia, it's all the same, probably a few years behind. But because of the regime of controls that we have, mainstream media are constrained very heavily, and new media are not. And because of this, new media receive an additional boost simply because of the government policies. It's just indirectly the government is supporting social media and online activism, which is growing by the hour. And the corruption, which is the sort of the main problem on which everyone is centered right now, is I think is from where we will go on further. As I mentioned before, traditional politics, mainstream politics, is almost a closed down field. You cannot enter. The enter barriers are simply unsurmountable. It's just it's not worth it, and not just it's not worth it, but if you really want to start a party, you probably can do, and all the democratic forces, for example, they can finally unite. But by the very fact of getting this license in the end, they will cease to be an independent force. So the system is designed very nicely so that even if you manage to get into the game, by the time you get there, you're no longer an independent player. It's just so they're very clever, the political engineers in who work for the Kremlin, but so far they left the whole sphere of social media, new media, really uncontrolled, almost. I mean, there's the whole host of measures that they are taking. It's mostly fake personas who are acting as bloggers and online activists, but that's a different story. Essentially, there's nothing of the scale of the Chinese Great Firewall. So this is a promising beginning, I think. And just to close, to wrap up, I think that there are very sad developments, like the demise of mainstream media and the spread of corruption, which is almost like cancer is spreading even outside Russia's borders, but that's a different subject. And then but then, because of the policies of the government, you see a new environment emerging right in front of you, with lots of web activism, which is at a very early stage, and it's not yet producing anything that we can that can lead to let's say political change. I'm not even saying this, but eventually it will. It's just I don't see why it won't happen. One little thing I also want to say is that I don't really believe in incremental change. Unfortunately, I don't see how it would happen. Of course, there's change in people's minds, yes. And again, it's mostly we have new generations coming to the field, and they start to read and think, and they come up with their opinions. But by all measure, we do have a lot of independent-minded people, and this doesn't translate into any political change for years. It hasn't been, really, nothing. So it's all like it's all waiting. It's all there, almost ready, and you just need some critical juncture, some unfortunately crisis, which everyone hates to expect and to envision. No, but unfortunately, anything that would bring meaningful change would, I think, happen through a crisis. But there are very promising developments anyway. So.
So what I'd like to do is to ask for Stefan and Maria and Maxim to sit here on the panel, and then I'll ask a couple of questions, and I'm hoping then we can open the field up so that you all can ask the questions that you would like to know the answers to. Excuse me, grab my chair. Yeah, you go ahead. You go ahead. Oh, thanks, God. Great. Thank you. Well, we've heard a lot that leads us to think a lot about that this is a story that has so many different angles to it. It's hard to just go up the middle. So what I'd like to do is to concentrate on, again, the practical aspect of reporting in the region and the practical challenges that reporters and editors face when they're trying to get a story out. So I would like to start with Stefan. And Stefan, can you talk to us about the point at which, because you began in traditional media, you began in a traditional newspaper newsroom in Bucharest, right? And also, can you tell us about the period when you began to realize the depth of corruption in your own newsroom?
Well, that was pretty fast with the first two stories. When actually the first story I was investigating for about 6 months, I discovered that, so I was doing these takeouts and taking pictures about people connecting the head of the road police, Bucharest, to an organized crime structure, registering stolen cars from the Western countries.
Can you hear?
Okay.
A little louder, please.
Okay, so during this investigation, I was storing these pictures in the newsroom with the knowledge of the editors, and I discovered that somebody in the newsrooms just copied the pictures and sold them to the target of my investigation. And then
sold the pictures to the target of the investigation for that person to keep the pictures off the paper? Or?
Just to know in advance what we have on them. So that was just a small example. Then then I discovered that some of our stories keep being delayed for publication, and I was starting to realize why, and that our editors or head of the paper was having other kind of agenda and business interests that was more profitable to him not to publish the stories than to publish them. So we discovered taboo topics, and during the first 2 years, we kind of really fast realized that we need to have a sort of backup. So we registered this Center for Investigative Journalism using an international model. Of course, I mean, we were looking at the US. We had as a model investigative reporters and editors, and another Center for Investigative Journalism in San Francisco. And our plan was to build a sort of professional organization, but we had to decide actually pretty fast that we have to quit our paper and start working independently.
And so, for the people who actually stay behind, the young people like yourself who actually stay behind? I mean, is it fair to assume that all of them are complicit in this structure of opportunism, or are people simply making sort of what they consider to be realistic decisions on how to survive in an industry that they cannot control?
Sure, I cannot judge anybody. I mean, I have colleagues and some members of our center still work with some of the newspapers owned by various oligarchs. There is no general solution for everybody to quit their job and start a center like that. There is no room for that, and no business model for that. And of course, some of them, they try to do their best in that position. A lot of them have to work somewhere, so that's their decision how they do it, So, no, they are not all part of the corrupt system. Obviously, there are good reporters who actually go through more problems than we do, because we are already out of that system. They are still in, and they have to deal with that every day.
And so, Maria, let me ask you a question. Now, have you ever felt within your newsroom in Belarus direct pressure on you to actually report a story differently from how you saw that story or how you interpreted the story?
Well, in state media, obviously, when I was working for a newspaper for teenagers and our target audience was from like 12 to 17, we first got a request from the government to write how we will report on presidential election in 2001, though our audience were not even voting. And then the editor canceled the article about voting systems in the world, which I prepared with a political scientist trying to show on the examples of other countries to show what's good election or not. She was so scared, she decided to cancel it last minute, and it was in 2001, and I quit the newspaper very shortly and never came back to state press. But speaking about independent media, I personally didn't have problems, but I know that our editor-in-chief in the publication Inside Belarus was asked by the Ministry of Information to withdraw from reporting on one particular issue, which is really not newsworthy most of times. And it was President Lukashenko going on private skiing resort in Austria. I mean, when we reported on gays, when we reported on some strange helicopter selling deals in the government, they said, well, you're a bad press, but okay, go on. But they were really touchy about some things we would never expect they would be so touchy. And the problem of the system is that you never know when the government will try to advise you what to cover and what not. With the European Radio for Belarus, they don't even try because they know it's impossible. We better be illegal than even listen to what they suggest.
And so what form does that pressure take? Does someone call your editor? Does someone write a letter, or?
They try to refrain from letters because that would be physical evidence. They'll go to jail like 20 years later for that. They do it in two ways. They call the newspaper, but this is for something like, guys, you ran a story on something. No. And then the Security Council or Ministry of Information are asking the editor-in-chief to come and talk, and they never tell about what. So this is the way they try to execute the pressure. Of course, besides that, KGB, which is still called KGB in Belarus, is trying to press on individual journalists, but you never know in the reality how many people they have talked to and how many people thought that they have family and some other things and maybe applied some self-censorship. But officially it works like that, and censorship is prohibited in the Constitution.
I see. Let me ask you, Maxim, you mentioned in your comments that eventually, here we go. Being an editor is a tricky business. You know what I mean? And as an editorial page editor, you're independent, but you also have to think about your editor-in-chief. That the buck stops with her, so to speak. And also, can you talk to us about a specific example in which your opinion, the opinion that if these concerns did not exist, that you would have written for your editorial page, or at least sponsored for your editorial page, different from what actually got into the editorial page that day or at that time?
Well, it's It mostly has to do with publishing pieces that are considered dangerous.
For instance?
Like very recently, I've just been talking about this. We have a piece it's written by a guy who left Russia. He is a whistleblower, and most of the stuff he is already published online, and he just wrote a sort of follow-up about the case, and it's a case of top-ranking officials being complicit in building a palace on the Black Sea for Vladimir Putin, and it's actually a funny story because it's like everyone's discussing this. It's not that no one knows. Whoever has access to any online resource, I think by now people know about this. But the figures are huge. It's just it's a fine illustration of how deals are done in Russia. It's like a completely sort of secret location until it was publicized, and a huge palace, huge, enormous. I think it's like it's probably like in Saint Petersburg, or it's like probably almost like Versailles in Paris. It's near Paris. It's really huge. They built everything. It's like it's a compound. It's a very large compound, and it has a independent supply of all utilities, everything. But they don't admit that it's been built with the use of government money, which is essentially the accusation. The guy who published it, he says that I was part of the scheme. Here's this paper, here's this agreement, here's this. And so but the thing is that we cannot publish a piece by this guy because they would the next day they would file a lawsuit, and you can publish this online. This is a very sort of graphic example, and it's not finished yet. It's really I'm really hoping that we will manage to go through some compromises, and it's a long story. But the thing is that in cases like this, especially involving government corruption, you have problems. Government officials and big businesses. Whenever we are talking about ideas, some kind of analysis, even very critical, it's no problem at all. Khodorkovsky, the businessman who was mentioned before, we have a businessman who's been jailed for 8 years now, and almost, and he is sometimes from time to time he's contributing to our newspaper. I published a few pieces by him, and usually it wasn't a problem because this text it's an analysis. It's a think piece. It doesn't mention names. It doesn't point to very direct facts, and so this you can do a lot, even in mainstream media if you are independent. Like in our case, we can do that.
But in terms of this palace that was being built by the Black Sea, you can't have the whistleblower write his own op-ed piece. You might be able to put it on the web, from what you're saying, right? How else can you get to that story?
We actually published an investigative piece, and we will do more. So you can publish about it. It's really subtle. It's that a piece written by the man himself, with the names and with some specific figures, is tricky to publish because they will come up and say, this is an accusation, where is the document? And again, they will file a lawsuit, and the person who would be responsible would be the editor-in-chief. That's the system, that's how it works.
Right.
And when again, just to explain it, and when you publish an investigative piece, it goes through very rigorous editing, of course, and every figure and every comma is, we are sure that we have a pile of paperwork on anything that we publish, and that's why but you can imagine that there are gaps in this investigation, because there are some things that we simply, we don't have the paper for this particular thing, so it's not mentioned in the piece.
I see. And so, Stefan, let me ask you this. I mean, what if any role do whistleblowers play in Romania, in your experience, in some of the reports that you've done? And you talked a lot about the role of databases and being able to compare databases freely as a real boon to the kind of reporting that you do. Can you talk a little bit more about what can happen, what help specifically do reporters like yourself need, to have access to the databases that would be helpful in your work?
So first,
So whistleblowers first?
we don't face these kind of problems. I mean, if you like Maxim has in Russia, the problem is that you find information, you have the information. Let's say you have the resources, and then you cannot publish that. That was one of the problems. Then, thanks to the internet, we can publish things, and at some point, mainstream media will take that, and they will reprint that. And that's, if you have whistleblowers, I don't see it happening now in Romania that they will be arrested or something like that. And because there's also a very active, there are a few active organizations as NGOs, watchdogs, and we kind of collaborate with them. For instance, it happened a few years ago that 2 local journalists were arrested by the military because they were having a DVD with military maps of Romanian operations in Afghanistan. They received that from somebody, and the military thought that the journalists, they didn't publish that, just they had that and they ran that through their computers.
They were arrested because they simply had it?
Yeah, because they read that, and because they sent that DVD to their head newsroom in Bucharest. And so we gather other reporters in Bucharest, and we made a sort of show up in front of the prosecution office, organizing a trade of secret information that you can find online. So I can find a lot of databases that are really secret, but because of lack of technological knowledges, they end up online. So we kind of try to explain the government that it's not journalists' fault that they cannot protect their own secrets. So those journalists were released in the end. So if that happens, I see there will be a strong reaction to it, and we can deal with that. The problem is that you don't have the resources to find all this information, and the second problem is that that's why we kind of develop all these databases. Instead of sources, we develop resources, because a lot of times prosecutors or secret services and people who should investigate organized crime, they don't do that. So you have nowhere to start with. There is no investigation in place there.
It's almost like you need a good librarian.
Well,
you know what I mean?
yeah. So.
Yeah. As opposed to a whistleblower, as opposed to an individual who can come to you with a bunch of stuff.
Right. Well, sometimes we also do undercover reporting, to start with something, and then we go through traditional reporting to check facts, and we cross-check that with databases. It's a way of working because you don't have the investigations in the first place, the official investigations.
And so I'm going to ask Maria one last question, and then we can open things up. So Maria, the truth of the matter is, when you write something with your byline on it, I mean, this is your name. If it's manipulated by others, then that certainly can undermine your credibility with.
What do you mean by manipulated by others?
Meaning, if, for instance, if through government pressure or the pressure of any outsider on your editor to either change or change what you've written or to take out particular details or
No,
that
no,
sort
no,
of
that's not happening. They either cancel your article at all, or they call you after something's published saying nothing like that anymore. So it's not about changing what you have written. Of course, I mean, I don't know practices of other newspapers. I would say that some of the opposition newspapers in search of funding also received some money from oppositional candidates and politicians and changed their editorial policy substantially. But this is another problem of this closed market. But basically, because of the editor-in-chief is responsible for whatever you write, he or she in Belarus would rather not run your editorial piece at all, rather than try to change it or do something like that.
Are you in a situation where you can go back to Belarus after you get your master's degree and
Well,
report?
after this conference, probably not. You guys will make me famous. But the truth is, I'm not a political refugee. I'm not an immigrant. So yes, I do travel back to Belarus, and we have a possibility for people to be searched on the border or be in the lists of people who are not let out of the country. And a person can get into this list in 24 hours. So you never know.
So, yes, sir.
Of course, there are many problems and issues within the countries for expression of news and etc. I'm interested in, and of course, there's difficulties and a lot of controls, limited web and internet access. But how much English is taught in the school system such that UK and US news might be available should the internet access be opened up a little bit?
Well, because the level of English knowledge is not so good, and actually the system of education is even trying to cancel English language from schools, the government is using, though, the access to BBC and CNN. They're mostly tragic and about catastrophes, so this would even help the propaganda to show that you will have wonderful situation inside Belarus, and now look, the plane crashed there and the insurgents have killed 2 more soldiers. So this is a tricky question.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm an editor for Global Post, which is a news organization based here in Boston. And I was just interested to hear you say that because in the past 4 months or so, there's actually been a lot of coverage about exactly what is happening in Belarus on our website, but not very much even on ours, but in many others. And we have 2 of our journalists are actually accredited in Belarus. So I'm just curious why you think, especially in Belarus and in Russia, the government does not crack down on foreign journalists the way it does on native journalists, because there still is that freedom of the international press, and since it is available inside the country, it doesn't make much sense to me.
Okay, first, we have attention every 5 years when we have presidential election, and yes, and then when the blast happen every 6 years. So yes, we do have. Normally, there are no accredited journalists of major agency in our countries, and good job, Global Post for having people accredited there.
But our accredited journalists work for the BBC and the Financial Times.
Yeah, I know, but these are BBC and Financial Times and AFP are the only ones who have. The others, no one. They send Moscow or Warsaw correspondents who come with no knowledge of Belarus, but think that they know the whole regions and therefore can make their stories work well. Secondly, their audience is global, and Belarusian regime knows that it has a dubious reputation worldwide. So unless the people inside Belarus will not learn because they do not read your papers or very rarely access English versions of news, this is not the real threat. If it becomes a real threat, like Candea guys were expelled from the country and some other people were, Max, continue.
So essentially the question was, why don't the...
Why aren't foreign media regulated, foreign journalists in the country regulated like native journalists are?
Well, because Russia conforms to most international agreements, and on the face of it, we do have all the freedoms, including for the foreign press, and then they have all the privileged treatment. In fact, we have all the major media represented, except that many of them are actually leaving because it's just sometimes, for all kinds of reasons, including economic, but also simply because it's not that interesting sometimes. So they allow them to do whatever, and the president has, sometimes they organize events, they invite them, they give interviews. So that's not the way they work with it. They create environment where foreign press is marginal to the extent of almost nothing. We have 2 websites that translate foreign coverage of Russia into Russian, and those are considered the preserve of essentially, it's like an insane asylum. It's a designated space for Russia bashers, haters, Russophobes, as they call it. So essentially, almost any foreign correspondent, by your average man in the street, probably not in Moscow, but throughout the country, the average man in the street, or woman in the street, would think of a foreign correspondent as some kind of special agent whose main task is slandering, and so that's what they do. They create the environment. They don't mess up with the people. Although sometimes we do have actually cases of correspondents expelled or denied visa, like very recently with a British guy, I forget the name, unfortunately, from The Guardian. Yeah.
And so, Stefan, do you experience, I mean, does Romania have a similar landscape in terms of acceptance of foreign media officially, maybe suspicion of them on the ground?
Well, first, there were cases of foreign journalists who were surveilled and even put in the Secret Service reports that they slander Romanian image outside the country, which was the biggest fear of Ceausescu during the communist times, you know. So he was paying lobbyists and so on to have a really nice image outside the country. But I see another type of problem. Some reporters, and I think that's for the foreign news agencies, some of them kind of stay too long in Romania and become part of the establishment. And and talking about English taught in school, and it's not only English taught in school, it's also French and German, and people can really read international news coverage if they want. That's not a problem at all.
Okay, we have time for, unfortunately, one last question. Sir, you in the blue shirt?
I have a question for Stefan. Stefan, you had an interesting critique of foreign assistants, people who come in and train and so forth, the things that they're doing well. One of the things you said I found interesting, and I wonder if you can elaborate on this lack of respect for local traditions, and either literary traditions or journalistic traditions. So there's a disconnect, and I wonder if you can say more about what those traditions are and what the disconnect is.
Well, it's not the lack of respect. It's not taking into consideration that there was something in that area before, you know, Western Europeans or Americans were coming there. And one important thing is that it was the ignorance of existing and very active networks of the former propaganda journalists. So people used to work in the media business under the communist regime, and they were totally forgotten. I mean, they were not taken into consideration. They organize themselves and they react, and people kind of noticed that 10 years after '89. And also, I'm not talking about the tradition in journalism, because I don't think we have a really good tradition in journalism in Romania. But in terms of writing and how you tell a story and the structure of that, obviously there is a cultural background in every country, in every region.
Can you say just a little bit more about that in particular? I mean, the culture of storytelling and what might be different.
Yeah, it's different. I mean, obviously the language is different.
Right.
The structure of the language is different. The way you can tell a story in Romanian is different than the way you can tell it in English. And of course in French or in German.
Can you use a specific example of maybe a story that we know?
I think the local tradition is to tell stories in a more, you have a lot of background and context in the text. It's not this really clear American style to tell the story. And I think you have this in your areas where a story has a lot of references to past events or things that you should know if you're a reader, a local reader, you know.
Could I help out? It's a very literary kind of approach to journalism.
Right.
And in the Romanian case, in fact, it's a very francophone approach.
Right.
Or it used to be, to this literary kind of journalism. The language and the construction of the story
Sure.
Was more important than the facts. And the subjectifying the objective was really the approach.
Right.
But that's common. I think that's common.
Yeah, in Latin America, this is sort of the model as well.
I think that one very last remark is that when we started, we are a business paper, and that was one major issue that we had, because we needed to report about business, facts, and you needed to do all this routine, lead, some basic figures, then substantiating this stuff, and you write this in Russian and it reads like, it's
Like a haiku.
it's just, what is it? Is it a press release? It's not. I know we worked on it. It's like it's all there. It's the right kind of journalism, but you cannot. So we had to overcome a lot of cultural problems and I quickly switched to opinion actually. So in opinion, we are because this is where we have a tradition, and it's a huge one. But the thing is that before a certain period, in probably late 90s, the tradition of the Russian journalism was that you don't really have a difference between, or at least the audience doesn't know the difference between fact and opinion. And it has to be all there. And you read and you see the persona of the writer is important, it has to be, interesting. And so it's really, you call it French or whatever. In our case, it's really, I feel it like Russian. It's growing essentially from the 19th century.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. But if you would like to if you have additional questions for the panelists, please ask them after the panel is done. Thank you.